In a dimly lit room in ancient Alexandria, a physician made the first cut into human flesh, not to heal, but to understand. For thousands of years, the dead have been our greatest teachers, revealing secrets that the living could never tell. Tonight, as you drift towards sleep, let me take you on a journey through the quiet, profound history of autopsy, where darkness became enlightenment, and silence spoke volumes about what it means to be human. Before we begin, if you enjoy falling asleep to the gentle rhythm of history, consider subscribing and turning on notifications. Your support helps me create more journeys through time for your peaceful nights. Now, let's step back into the shadows of medical history. In the beginning, there was darkness, and in that darkness, humanity feared what lay beyond the veil of death. Long before the first intentional cut was made to understand the human form, our ancestors grappled with a profound tension that would echo through millennia. The body as a sacred vessel worthy of reverence, and the body as a mystery begging to be understood. This tension, born in the dusty tombs of ancient Egypt and whispered in the temples of early civilizations, would shape the entire trajectory of medical knowledge for thousands of years. Picture the banks of the Nile around 3,000 years before the Common Era. The sun beats down on limestone cliffs, and within carefully constructed chambers, Egyptian embalmers perform their sacred duty. These practitioners, working in the service of eternity, developed techniques that would inadvertently lay the groundwork for anatomical knowledge. Yet their purpose was never scientific inquiry. Their goal was preservation, the transformation of the mortal body into a vessel fit for the journey through the afterlife. The embalming process itself was an intricate ritual that required intimate knowledge of the body's interior. Through the nose, using long bronze hooks, embalmers would carefully extract the brain, understanding that this organ, though they knew not its function, must be removed to prevent decay. The brain was considered so unimportant that it was simply discarded, while the heart, believed to be the seat of intelligence and emotion, was carefully preserved within the chest cavity. This tells us something profound about how our ancestors understood themselves, how the physical landscape of the body was mapped onto a spiritual geography that made sense within their worldview. The embalmers made an incision along the left side of the abdomen, through which they would remove the internal organs. The liver, lungs, stomach, and intestines were extracted, treated, and placed in canopic jars, each protected by a different deity. The precision required for this work meant that these practitioners knew the location and general arrangement of human organs. They understood that the body contained distinct structures, each with its own form and character. They knew the density of the liver, the delicacy of the lungs, the length of the intestines. Yet this knowledge remained locked within the context of ritual, never systematically recorded, never questioned or explored beyond its religious function. This separation between practical knowledge and theoretical understanding characterizes much of ancient anatomy. The embalmers learned through repetition, through the accumulated wisdom of generations, but they were not permitted to ask why. The body was not theirs to question. It belonged to the gods, to the eternal order of things, and to disturb that order for the sake of curiosity alone would have been unthinkable sacrilege. Across the ancient world, similar prohibitions existed, though they took different forms in different cultures. In ancient India, religious texts acknowledged the body's complexity, and Ayurvedic medicine developed sophisticated theories about health and disease. Yet the dissection of human cadavers was forbidden by Hindu beliefs about the sanctity of the body and the transmigration of souls. The dead were to be cremated, returned to the elements, not opened and examined. What anatomical knowledge existed came from careful external observation, from treating wounds in war, from the butchering of animals, and from philosophical speculation about the nature of life and the organization of living things. In ancient China, Confucian principles emphasized filial piety and the importance of honoring one's ancestors. The body received from one's parents was considered a sacred inheritance that must not be damaged or violated. To cut into a corpse was to dishonor not only the deceased, but the entire lineage from which they came. This profound respect for the physical form meant that Chinese medicine developed along different pathways, emphasizing the flow of qi, the balance of yin and yang, and the complex relationships between organs understood more as functional systems than as discrete anatomical structures. The ancient Hebrews maintained strict laws about corpse contamination. Contact with the dead rendered one ritually impure, requiring specific purification rites before one could participate in religious life. This was not merely superstition, but a comprehensive worldview in which life and death occupied separate spheres that must not be carelessly mixed. The dead were to be buried quickly, with respect, and then left undisturbed. To open a body would have been to compound impurity with desecration, to violate both the deceased and the divine order. These prohibitions were not simply arbitrary rules imposed by religious authorities. They emerged from deeply held beliefs about the nature of human existence, about the relationship between body and soul, between the material and the spiritual. In most ancient cultures, the body was understood as a temporary dwelling place for something eternal. To focus too much attention on the physical form was to miss the point of human existence entirely. The body would decay and return to dust. What mattered was the soul, the spirit, the eternal essence that would continue beyond death. Yet even within these restrictive frameworks, knowledge accumulated slowly, quietly in the margins. Physicians treating battlefield wounds observed the layers of tissue, the arrangement of muscles, the pathways of blood vessels. Midwives assisting in difficult births gained understanding of pelvic anatomy. Healers setting broken bones learned the structure of the skeleton. This knowledge was practical, immediate, and necessary, but it remained fragmentary, never assembled into a comprehensive understanding of human anatomy. The tension between sacred prohibition and practical necessity created a peculiar situation. Everyone acknowledged that the body had an interior, that beneath the skin lay organs and structures that influenced health and disease. Theories abounded about the nature of these hidden parts, but they remained theories, philosophical constructs that could not be verified or refined through direct observation. The heart was believed to be the center of thought in some cultures, the liver in others. The brain was considered a cooling organ, a producer of mucus, anything but the seat of consciousness. Blood was thought to ebb and flow like tides, or to be consumed and regenerated, or to carry the vital spirit through hollow vessels. These misconceptions would persist for millennia because the one method that could have corrected them, systematic human dissection, remained forbidden. The irony is profound. Ancient peoples cared deeply about health, about healing, about understanding disease. Yet they were constrained by their very reverence for life from pursuing the knowledge that might have allowed them to preserve it more effectively. In Egypt, despite the embalmer's intimate familiarity with the body's interior, this knowledge never transformed into anatomical science. The practitioners were separate from the physician class. They worked in isolation, their knowledge considered ritually impure, necessary for the sacred task of preservation, but not suitable for the halls of learning. What they knew died with them, passed only through apprenticeship within their closed profession, never written down in the medical papyri that survived from ancient Egypt. The Edwin Smith Papyrus, one of the oldest known surgical texts, reveals both the sophistication and the limitations of Egyptian medical knowledge. It describes various injuries and their treatments with remarkable precision, recognizing that damage to certain parts of the body produces specific symptoms. Yet it contains no systematic description of anatomy, no sense that understanding the normal structure might illuminate the abnormal condition. This pattern repeated itself across the ancient world. Knowledge existed in fragments, in practical wisdom accumulated through experience, in philosophical speculation about the nature of life and the organization of the cosmos. But the comprehensive, systematic study of human anatomy remained impossible, blocked not by lack of intelligence or curiosity, but by the powerful belief that some knowledge was forbidden, that some boundaries were not meant to be crossed, that the dead deserved peace and the gods demanded respect. The body as sacred vessel dominated human consciousness for thousands of years. It shaped not only medicine but law, religion, art, and culture. The prohibition against desecration was nearly universal, rooted in the fundamental human impulse to honor the dead, to maintain the boundary between the living and the deceased, to preserve the dignity of the human form even after death. Yet beneath this prohibition, another impulse stirred quietly, growing stronger as civilizations became more complex, as cities grew larger, as human society became more dependent on specialized knowledge. This was the impulse to understand, to look beneath the surface, to ask not just what works but why it works, to transform practical experience into theoretical knowledge. This impulse would eventually find its expression in a remarkable moment in human history. In a city on the Mediterranean coast, where Greek rationalism met Egyptian learning, where the prohibition against dissection would briefly lift, and where human beings would finally begin to read the book of the body written in flesh and blood. But that moment was still centuries away, still waiting for the right combination of intellectual freedom, political power, and cultural shift. For now, in these ancient times, the body remained mysterious, sacred, and untouchable. The dead kept their secrets, and the living could only wonder at what lay beneath the skin, creating elaborate theories that would endure for millennia, built on imagination and philosophy rather than direct observation. In the darkness before the dawn of anatomical science, humanity honored its dead and remained ignorant of the very vessels that carried them through life. The year is approximately 300 years before the Common Era, and the world is changing. Alexander the Great has died, his vast empire fragmenting into pieces, and in the delta of the Nile a new city rises. Alexandria, named for the conqueror who envisioned it, becomes something unprecedented in human history, a deliberate creation designed to be the intellectual center of the world. Here, Greek philosophy meets Egyptian wisdom, Persian astronomy mingles with Babylonian mathematics, and in this unprecedented melting pot of ideas, something extraordinary happens. For a brief, shining moment, the ancient prohibition against examining the human body lifts, and two men step forward to read what has never been read before. The city itself seems designed for discovery. The legendary library of Alexandria grows day by day, its shelves filling with scrolls from every corner of the known world. The museum, not a collection of artifacts but a temple to the muses, becomes home to scholars who are paid simply to think, to study, to push the boundaries of human knowledge. The Ptolemaic rulers, Greek pharaohs of Egypt, understand that power comes not just from armies but from wisdom, from being the place where knowledge is created and preserved. They pour resources into scholarship, creating an environment where intellectual inquiry flourishes as never before. Into this remarkable setting come two physicians whose names echo faintly through history, known to us mostly through the writings of others, their own works lost in the fires and failures of subsequent centuries. Herophilus of Chalcedon and Erasistratus of Chios arrive in Alexandria at different times, but both find themselves in a unique position. The Ptolemaic rulers, perhaps influenced by the Egyptian tradition of opening bodies for embalming, perhaps motivated by pure intellectual curiosity, perhaps seeking to demonstrate the superiority of their enlightened rule, grant permission for something that has never been officially sanctioned before, the systematic dissection of human corpses for the purpose of understanding anatomy. Imagine Herophilus entering the dissection chamber for the first time. The room is likely simple, practical, with good light. Natural illumination is essential for this work. Before him lies a human body, a criminal executed by the state, now serving a different purpose. For thousands of years, such a body would have been buried, burned, or left to decay. But now, with official permission, with the backing of royal authority, Herophilus can do what no one has been permitted to do before. He can look inside. The first cut must have been momentous, a boundary crossed that could never be uncrossed. But Herophilus is methodical, careful. He is not simply satisfying curiosity, he is building a science. He names what he sees, creating a vocabulary for structures that have existed forever, but never been formally described. The brain, that organ the Egyptians discarded as worthless, reveals itself to be extraordinarily complex. Herophilus traces the pathways of nerves, themselves a discovery, for before this, nerves and tendons were not clearly distinguished. He identifies what we now call the cerebrum and cerebellum, noting their different textures and positions. Going deeper, Herophilus makes a discovery that will echo through the centuries. At the base of the brain, he finds a confluence of venous channels, a meeting place of blood vessels that he describes with poetic precision. Later anatomists will call it the torcular hierophily, Herophilus's winopress, because its appearance reminds him of the press used to extract juice from grapes. This is not just description, it is the beginning of a new language, a way of transforming the mute flesh into something that can be discussed, taught, understood. The eye, that window to the soul, receives Herophilus's careful attention. He traces the optic nerve, understanding for the first time that vision depends on a physical connection between eye and brain. He describes the retina, the vitreous humor, the structures that make sight possible. Each observation contradicts centuries of philosophical speculation. The eye is not a lamp projecting fire outward, as some theories claimed, but a receiver, connected by a tangible pathway to the seat of perception, moving through the body. Herophilus examines the liver with particular care. In an age when many believe this organ to be the center of life, he describes it accurately, noting its lobes, its texture, its relationship to other organs. He traces the portal vein, understanding that blood from the intestines flows to the liver before circulating elsewhere. This suggests purpose organization, a body that operates according to principles that can be discovered and understood. But perhaps his most significant contribution comes from his study of the circulatory system. Herophilus distinguishes between arteries and veins, noting that they have different wall thicknesses, different characteristics. He observes that arteries have a pulse, and he develops the radical theory that this pulse originates in the heart, not in the vessels themselves as many believed. He even creates methods for measuring the pulse, recognizing that its rate and character can indicate health or disease. This transforms diagnosis from philosophical interpretation to measurable observation. The heart itself reveals its secrets under Herophilus's careful examination. He describes the valves, those remarkable structures that ensure blood flows in the right direction. The tricuspid valve, the mitral valve, he sees them, understands their function, marvels at their engineering. The heart is not a source of heat or the seat of intelligence, as various theories claimed. It is a pump, brilliantly designed, central to the body's operation but operating through mechanical principles that can be comprehended. While Herophilus works, another brilliant mind approaches the same material from a different angle. Erasistratus, possibly a student of Herophilus or perhaps his contemporary, brings a more physiological approach to dissection. Where Herophilus describes structure, Erasistratus seeks to understand function. How does the body work? What are the mechanisms that transform food into life, that allow movement and thought? Erasistratus makes his own crucial discoveries. He traces nerves with even greater precision than Herophilus, distinguishing between sensory and motor nerves, those that carry sensation to the brain and those that carry commands to muscles. This is a profound insight, suggesting that the nervous system is not simply a network, but an organized communication system with specific purposes and pathways. The brain fascinates Erasistratus as it did Herophilus, But Erasistratus goes further. He notes the convolutions of the cerebrum, the folds and wrinkles that characterize the human brain. Through comparative anatomy, examining animal brains alongside human ones, he observes that more intelligent animals have more complex brain convolutions. This suggests, daringly, that intelligence resides in the brain, not the heart. The very structure of this organ, so long dismissed as a radiator or mucus producer, holds the key to what makes us human. Erasistratus develops theories about how the body functions. He believes that air breathed into the lungs travels through invisible channels to every part of the body, combining with blood to create vital spirit. While this theory is incorrect by modern standards, it represents a crucial shift in thinking. Erasistratus is attempting to explain bodily functions through mechanical processes, not mystical forces. The body operates according to rules, and those rules can be discovered. His work on the digestive system reveals careful observation. He traces the path of food through the stomach and intestines, noting the muscular contractions that move it along. He describes the lacteals, vessels that carry digested nutrients, though he misunderstands their exact nature. He examines the liver, the spleen, the pancreas, attempting to understand their roles in transforming food into the substance of life. Both men work with an urgency born of opportunity. They know, perhaps, that this window will not remain open forever. They dissect dozens of bodies, possibly even hundreds. Some ancient sources, controversial and disputed, suggest they may have practiced vivisection on condemned criminals, opening living bodies to observe the function of organs in action. Whether this occurred or represents later slander against their work, we cannot know with certainty. What we do know is that in the space of perhaps 50 years, these men and their immediate students learn more about human anatomy than the entire previous history of medicine. The knowledge they generate spreads through the ancient world. Students come to Alexandria to study, carrying what they learn back to Greece, to Rome, to the far reaches of the Hellenistic world. Medical texts begin to reflect this new anatomical understanding. Surgical techniques improve because physicians now have better knowledge of what lies beneath the skin. The human body, for the first time in history, becomes a known territory rather than a realm of speculation. But even as this knowledge spreads, the conditions that made it possible begin to shift. The political climate changes. The Ptolemaic rulers who supported unrestricted inquiry give way to more conservative successors. Public opinion, never entirely comfortable with the dissection of human bodies, begins to reassert itself. The practice, though legally sanctioned, carries a stigma. Philosophers and religious thinkers question whether such knowledge is worth the violation it requires. The Romans, as they expand their power eastward, bring different cultural values. Roman law and tradition emphasize respect for the dead. The practical Romans admire Greek learning, but they find the dissection of human corpses distasteful, unnecessary, perhaps impious. As Roman influence grows, the practice that flourished in Alexandria begins to seem less acceptable, more controversial. By the 1st century of the Common Era, human dissection has essentially ceased. The reasons are complex, a mixture of political, cultural, and religious factors. The rise of new religious movements, including early Christianity, brings renewed emphasis on the sanctity of the body and the resurrection of the dead. The idea of cutting up corpses becomes not just distasteful but potentially blasphemous. The body is a temple, a creation of God, deserving of reverence even in death. But perhaps more significantly, the unique conditions that made Alexandrian dissection possible simply could not be replicated elsewhere or sustained over time. It required royal support, cultural tolerance, a supply of bodies, and crucially, a certain intellectual independence from religious and cultural prohibitions. As the Hellenistic world gave way to the Roman Empire, as religious certainty replaced philosophical speculation, these conditions evaporated. The works of Herophilus and Erasistratus, written on papyrus scrolls stored in libraries, begin their long journey into oblivion. Some are copied, and the copies are copied, each generation of copying introducing errors, losing details. Others are simply lost, burned in fires, discarded as libraries close, or are destroyed, forgotten as intellectual fashions change. By the 2nd century CE, no one is reading Herophilus in the original. His ideas survive only in fragments, in quotes by later authors, in second-hand summaries that may or may not capture his actual observations. A physician named Galen, working in the 2nd century CE, becomes the bridge between the Alexandrian Golden Age and the long medieval night to come. Galen knows the work of Herophilus and Erasistratus. He respects their observations, refers to their discoveries. But Galen himself cannot dissect human bodies. The practice is forbidden in Rome, unthinkable in the cultural climate of his time. Instead, Galen dissects animals, pigs, goats, monkeys, and extrapolates to human anatomy. He assumes that what is true for a Barbary ape must be true for a human being. This is a reasonable assumption, but it is wrong in crucial details. Animal hearts have structural differences from human hearts. Animal brains are organized differently. The network of blood vessels, the shape of organs, the details that Herophilus and Erasistratus observed directly in human cadavers, these vary between species. But Galen has no choice. He works with what is available, and his work is brilliant within its constraints. He conducts experiments, demonstrates that cutting certain nerves produces specific paralysis, shows that arteries contain blood, not air as some ancient theories claimed. Galen's writings are encyclopedic, detailed, and confident. They represent the pinnacle of ancient medical knowledge, incorporating the discoveries of Alexandria while adding his own extensive observations. His work will dominate medicine for the next 1400 years, becoming almost scriptural in its authority. But here is the tragedy: Galen's errors, born of his inability to dissect humans, become as authoritative as his correct observations. Future generations, equally unable to verify his claims through human dissection, will accept his mistakes along with his insights. The knowledge gained in Alexandria, that brief flowering of direct observation, becomes frozen in Galen's texts. The anatomical facts discovered by Herophilus and Erasistratus survive, but they survive mixed with errors, interpreted through Galen's animal-based understanding, and increasingly divorced from the observational method that generated them. The idea that knowledge comes from looking directly at nature, from careful dissection and description, fades. What remains is authority, the written word, the classical text to be memorized and revered rather than tested and questioned. As Christianity spreads through the Mediterranean world, as the Roman Empire fragments and falls, as the classical civilization that supported Alexandrian science collapses, the very memory of that golden age dims. By the early Middle Ages, physicians know that Herophilus and Erasistratus once dissected human bodies. But this knowledge seems almost mythical, something from a distant past when different rules applied. The idea that such a practice might be revived, that direct observation might once again illuminate human anatomy, does not seriously occur to anyone for over 1,000 years. The loss is staggering. Imagine if the Alexandrian tradition had continued, if each generation of physicians had built on the observations of the previous one, if the method of careful dissection and description had become standard practice. The history of medicine would have been utterly different. Diseases might have been understood centuries earlier. Surgical techniques could have advanced based on accurate anatomical knowledge. The human body might have yielded its secrets gradually, steadily through systematic investigation. Instead, that knowledge slips away, preserved imperfectly in texts that fewer and fewer people can read, in languages that become obscure, in libraries that burn or crumble. The brief window when humans could legally and systematically study their own anatomy closes, and it will not open again for 1,300 years. When it finally does reopen in the Renaissance, physicians will have to rediscover what Herophilus and Erasistratus knew, learning again through dissection what had once been learned and then forgotten. But the Alexandrian moment leaves an invisible legacy. It proves that such knowledge is possible, that the human body can be understood through direct observation, that the prohibition against desecration can be set aside in the service of learning. This proof, even though largely forgotten, even though transmitted only through second-hand accounts and garbled summaries, keeps alive the possibility of anatomical science. Somewhere in the back of medical consciousness, the example of Alexandria persists, a reminder that once, briefly, humans dared to look inside themselves and found not sacrilege but understanding, not divine punishment but natural law, not chaos but design. That memory, faint as it becomes, will eventually help spark the revival of human dissection when the time is finally right, when the intellectual and cultural conditions align once more to permit humanity to study itself with open eyes and steady hands. In the year 129 of the Common Era, in the city of Pergamon in what is now Turkey, a child is born who will cast a shadow over medicine for 14 centuries. His name is Galen, and he will become perhaps the most influential physician who ever lived, not because his observations were always correct, but because his words would be treated as sacred truth long after anyone could verify them. His story is the story of how brilliance can become prison, how respect can ossify into dogma, how the very success of one man's work can prevent progress for 1,000 years. Galen grows up in a prosperous family. His father, an architect and philosopher, ensures his son receives the finest education available. The young Galen studies philosophy, mathematics, logic, and eventually medicine. He is brilliant, ambitious, and possessed of an ego that matches his considerable talents. At 17, he begins his medical training, traveling to the great centers of learning, Smyrna, Corinth, and most importantly, Alexandria. In Alexandria, he studies the texts of Herophilus and Erasistratus, absorbing their anatomical discoveries, learning from their observations, even though the practice of human dissection has long since ceased. But Galen faces a fundamental problem. He lives in the Roman Empire, and Roman culture, despite its admiration for Greek learning, finds the dissection of human corpses repugnant. Roman law protects the dignity of the dead, religious sensibilities, both traditional Roman beliefs and the newer mystery religions spreading through the empire, emphasize the sanctity of the human body. The idea of cutting open a person, even a criminal, even with official permission, is simply unthinkable in this cultural context. So Galen improvises. If he cannot dissect humans, he will dissect everything else. He studies pigs whose internal organs resemble those of humans. He examines goats, dogs, and bears. Most importantly, he dissects Barbary apes, whose anatomy is remarkably similar to human anatomy. Through these animal studies, Galen makes genuine discoveries. He demonstrates that arteries carry blood, not air as some theories claim. He shows that the brain controls the body by cutting spinal cords at different levels and observing the resulting paralysis. He identifies 7 pairs of cranial nerves. He describes muscles with unprecedented precision. His work as a physician to gladiators in Pergamon gives him opportunities that most doctors never have. Gladiatorial combat produces terrible wounds, and treating these wounds allows Galen to observe human anatomy in ways that would otherwise be impossible. A sword slash that opens the abdomen reveals the arrangement of intestines. A deep cut to the arm exposes muscles, nerves, and blood vessels. These glimpses into living human anatomy supplement his animal dissections, allowing him to build a comprehensive picture of the human body. Galen's ambition eventually takes him to Rome, where he becomes physician to emperors. Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher-emperor, becomes his patient and patron. Galen's practice flourishes, his fame spreads, and he begins to write, and write, and write. By the end of his life, he has produced hundreds of works covering every aspect of medicine, anatomy, physiology, pathology, therapeutics, even philosophy. His output is staggering, his confidence absolute. He does not present his ideas tentatively or acknowledge uncertainty. He writes with the authority of someone who knows, completely and finally, how the human body works, and much of what he writes is correct, or close enough to correct that it serves medicine well. His descriptions of bones are accurate, because bones could be studied in human skeletons without violating cultural prohibitions. His observations on muscles, based on careful dissection of apes, are largely sound. His work on the pulse, building on Herophilus's discoveries, becomes the foundation for diagnosis for centuries. His understanding of the brain as the seat of consciousness contradicts Aristotle and represents genuine insight. But woven through this tapestry of accurate observation are threads of error, errors born of his reliance on animal anatomy. The human liver has structural differences from the pig liver Galen dissected. The network of blood vessels at the base of the human brain, the rete mirabile, or wonderful net, that Galen describes so carefully, exists in ungulates but not in humans. The human heart has subtle anatomical features that differ from the ape heart. The uterus, the kidneys, countless small but significant details are wrong, not because Galen is careless but because he is observing the wrong species. More problematically, Galen develops an entire physiological system based on these anatomical observations. Blood, he theorizes, is produced in the liver from digested food. This blood flows through veins to nourish the body's tissues, where it is consumed. Meanwhile, a different kind of blood flows through arteries, carrying vital spirit generated in the heart through mixture with air from the lungs. The brain transforms this vital spirit into animal spirit, which flows through hollow nerves to animate the body. It is an elegant system, internally consistent, and completely wrong in its fundamental conception. This physiological theory becomes inseparable from Galen's anatomical descriptions. To question one is to question the other, and as Galen's works spread through the late Roman world, they become not just influential but definitive. Medical schools teach Galen. Physicians study Galen. To be a doctor means to know Galen's writings, to accept his authority, to treat his words as the final truth about the human body. Then the Roman Empire begins its long, complex dissolution. In the West, political chaos disrupts the institutions that preserved and transmitted knowledge. Libraries are destroyed, schools close, literacy declines. The great urban centers where medicine flourished shrink or are abandoned. But before classical learning is entirely lost, something remarkable happens. Christian monasteries begin to preserve ancient texts, copying manuscripts, maintaining libraries, keeping knowledge alive through the tumultuous centuries of migration and transformation. The Church's relationship with ancient medicine, particularly with the study of the body, is intricate and often misunderstood. Christianity emphasizes the resurrection of the body, the idea that the physical form will be restored and glorified in the afterlife. This creates a deep reverence for bodily integrity. The body is not just a temporary vessel but an integral part of human identity, destined for eternal existence. To violate a corpse is not merely distasteful. It seems to interfere with God's plan for that person's resurrection. Yet Christianity also values healing. Jesus healed the sick, and caring for the suffering is considered a fundamental Christian duty. Monasteries operate hospitals. Monks study medicinal herbs. The Church does not reject medicine, it incorporates it into its mission of charity. But the kind of medicine it supports is practical, therapeutic, focused on helping the living rather than exploring the dead. This creates a paradox. The Church preserves Galen's texts as part of the classical inheritance it seeks to maintain. Monks copy his anatomical treatises alongside scripture and philosophy. But the Church does not encourage the method that could verify or correct Galen's observations. Human dissection remains unthinkable. Not because of any specific prohibition, the Church never explicitly bans it in these early centuries, but because cultural and religious attitudes make it seem wrong, disrespectful, contrary to the proper treatment of human remains. In the Islamic world, a different but parallel process unfolds. Muslim scholars translate Greek medical texts into Arabic, preserving knowledge that might otherwise have been lost. Physicians like Avicenna and Rises build upon Galen's foundation, adding their own observations and insights. But they too cannot dissect human bodies. Islamic law, like Christian teaching and Roman tradition, protects the dignity of the dead. The body must be buried quickly, with respect intact. So Islamic medicine, brilliant as it becomes in pharmacology and clinical observation, inherits Galen's anatomical errors along with his genuine discoveries. By the early Middle Ages, Galen's authority is absolute. In both Christian Europe and the Islamic world, medicine means Galenic medicine. His anatomical descriptions are not questioned because they cannot be questioned. Without human dissection, there is no way to verify his claims. His errors are not obvious. They require direct comparison between his descriptions and actual human anatomy, a comparison that nobody is performing. Medical education becomes scholastic, focused on mastering authoritative texts rather than observing nature. A physician's training involves memorizing Galen, reading commentaries on Galen, learning to reconcile apparent contradictions in Galen's vast corpus. The idea of looking at an actual body to check whether Galen is correct simply does not occur to most medieval physicians, or if it occurs, it seems unnecessary. Why would Galen be wrong? He was brilliant, experienced, meticulous. Surely his descriptions can be trusted. This intellectual framework creates a kind of stasis. Medical knowledge does advance in some areas, surgery improves through practical experience, new drugs are discovered, clinical observation of diseases becomes more sophisticated. But fundamental understanding of human anatomy and physiology remains frozen in the Galenic framework. Physicians believe the liver produces blood because Galen said so. They believe blood is consumed in the tissues because Galen said so. They believe in the rete mirabile, in Galen's account of the heart's structure, in his descriptions of organs that he never actually saw in human form. The few times someone does observe human anatomy directly, the experience is filtered through Galenic expectations. When medieval surgeons operate, when they see the actual arrangement of organs, they interpret what they see in Galenic terms. If something looks different from Galen's description, the assumption is that this particular body is abnormal, or that the observer is misunderstanding what they see. The possibility that Galen might be wrong is almost literally unthinkable. It would be like suggesting that Euclid's geometry is incorrect, or that Aristotle's logic is flawed. These are foundation certainties, truths upon which all other knowledge rests. This reverence for ancient authority reflects the medieval worldview more broadly. Knowledge is not something to be discovered, but something to be recovered. The ancients, Aristotle, Ptolemy, Galen, knew truths that have been partially lost. The task of scholars is to preserve these truths, to understand them fully, to reconcile apparent contradictions, not to question or replace them. Innovation means finding new applications for old truths, not discovering new truths that might contradict the old. The university system, as it develops in the 12th and 13th centuries, institutionalizes this approach. Medical faculties are established at Salerno, Bologna, Paris, Oxford. These universities represent genuine progress. They create formal training, standards, a community of learned physicians. But they also entrench Galenic medicine. The curriculum is based on set texts. Students attend lectures where professors read and comment on Galen. Examinations test knowledge of these authoritative works. To graduate as a physician means to demonstrate mastery of Galenic theory. Around 1315, something potentially revolutionary occurs. At the University of Bologna, a professor named Mondino de Lozzi begins to perform public dissections of human cadavers. This seems like it should shatter the Galenic spell. Finally, direct observation of human anatomy is possible again. But the way these dissections are conducted reveals how thoroughly Galenic thinking has permeated medical education. Mondino's dissections are not primarily investigative. They are demonstrations, visual confirmations of what the texts already say. The professor sits in a high chair, reading from Galen. A barber surgeon lower in status performs the actual cutting. Students observe, seeing the organs that Galen described. When what they see differs from the text, the assumption is that they are misinterpreting the evidence, not that the text is wrong. Mondino himself writes an anatomical manual that largely repeats Galen, incorporating the observations from his dissections only where they seem to align with classical authority. These public dissections do become more common in the 14th and 15th centuries, but they remain constrained by the framework of ancient authority. They are rare events, often conducted as part of public spectacles or festivals. The bodies used are typically those of executed criminals, and there are never enough of them to allow systematic study. A medical student might witness 1 or 2 dissections during their entire education. If that, this is not sufficient to build genuine anatomical knowledge or to recognize systematic errors in the classical texts. The Black Death, arriving in Europe in the mid-14th century, kills perhaps a third of the population. Physicians prove helpless against it. Their Galenic theories of disease, imbalances in the 4 humors, miasmas in the air, astrological influences offer no effective protection or treatment. This catastrophic failure might have prompted questioning of medical authority, but instead it often reinforces it. The plague is seen as punishment for sin, as something beyond natural explanation, as a mystery that even the ancients could not have fully understood. Through all these centuries, Galen's shadow lengthens. His works are translated from Greek into Latin, from Arabic into Latin, commented upon, summarized, incorporated into encyclopedias. His name becomes synonymous with medical wisdom. Galen says, ends arguments, settles disputes, defines what is possible and impossible. The man who dissected apes 400 years after human dissection ceased in Alexandria becomes the eternal authority on human anatomy. There are quiet rebels, voices in the wilderness questioning aspects of Galenic theory. Some physicians notice that clinical experience doesn't always match what the texts predict. Some surgeons working directly with wounded bodies observe things that seem inconsistent with Galen's descriptions. But these doubts remain marginal, unpublished, uncertain. Without systematic human dissection, without a method for checking Galen's claims, these questions cannot develop into genuine critique. The irony is profound and tragic. Galen himself was an empiricist, someone who believed in observation and experiment. His entire career was built on looking at nature directly, on dissecting animals when humans were unavailable, on learning from wounds and injuries. But his successors transform him into the opposite, an authority whose words replace observation, whose texts obviate the need for direct investigation. The method is forgotten while the conclusions are preserved. The spirit of inquiry that animated Galen's work dies, while his specific claims become immortal. By the early 16th century, human anatomy has been in this frozen state for 1400 years. Medical students learn from texts written by a man who never dissected a human being, based partly on observations of a brief golden age in Alexandria that ended centuries before Galen was born. The errors are embedded so deeply in medical thinking that they have become invisible. The rete mirabile that doesn't exist in humans is described in every anatomical text. The 5-lobed liver that Galen saw in pigs is assumed to be the normal human form. The septum of the heart, which Galen claimed was perforated to allow blood to pass from right ventricle to left, is depicted with invisible pores in every illustration. This is not simple ignorance. It is a more complex phenomenon, a kind of learned blindness where sophisticated, intelligent people cannot see what is in front of them, because their conceptual framework prevents it. A physician could look at a human heart during dissection and still believe it worked as Galen described, because the theory explained the observations, made sense of them, provided a complete and satisfying account. To question this would require not just noticing discrepancies, but having the conceptual courage to suggest that the entire edifice might be wrong. That courage is coming, carried by the winds of change that are beginning to blow through European culture. The Renaissance is awakening interest in classical sources, but also in nature itself. The printing press is making texts more widely available, allowing comparison and critical reading. The Protestant Reformation is challenging the monopoly of traditional authority in religious matters, creating an intellectual climate where questioning tradition seems less dangerous. Humanism is emphasizing direct engagement with original sources rather than medieval commentaries. All of these forces are gathering, preparing to break the spell that Galen's shadow has cast over medicine for so long, but in 1500 that break has not yet occurred. Physicians still learn anatomy from books, still believe that mastering Galen's texts is sufficient for understanding the human body, still assume that ancient wisdom surpasses anything that could be learned from simply looking at corpses. The long night of Galenic authority continues, even as the first hints of dawn begin to appear on the intellectual horizon. The body remains mysterious, known through texts rather than touch, understood through theory rather than observation, trapped in descriptions written by a brilliant man who never saw what he was describing. It will take a revolution to change this, a revolution in method, in authority, in the very conception of what it means to know something about the natural world. The first cracks in Galen's monument appear not with thunderous revolution, but with the quiet turning of a page, the careful cut of a scalpel, the tentative question whispered in a lecture hall. The year is 1315, and in Bologna, a city of learning in northern Italy, something happens that has not occurred openly in Europe for over 1,000 years. Mondino de Luzzi, a professor of anatomy, conducts a public dissection of a human cadaver. It is a small thing perhaps in the vast sweep of history, but it is a beginning, a door opening onto possibilities that have been locked away since Alexandria fell silent. Bologna in the early 14th century is already famous for its university, particularly for legal studies. The city has developed a tradition of post-mortem examinations for legal purposes, autopsies conducted to determine cause of death in cases of suspected murder or other crimes. This practical necessity has created a slight loosening of the absolute prohibition against opening human bodies. If corpses can be examined to serve justice, perhaps they can also be examined to serve knowledge. It is a small logical step, but it crosses a boundary that has stood for centuries. Mondino's dissection is a formal affair, a public event with protocols and hierarchies. He does not perform the dissection himself. Such manual labor would be beneath the dignity of a university professor. Instead, a barber surgeon, a craftsman rather than a scholar, wields the knife while Mondino sits elevated, reading from texts, pointing to organs as they are revealed, explaining what the students are seeing by reference to classical authorities. The body lies at the center, surrounded by observers, but in some sense it remains peripheral to the real event, which is the explication of Galen and other ancient writers. Yet even this limited, theory-bound approach represents progress. Students can now see the organs they have only read about. The liver, when exposed, has color, texture, weight. The heart is not an abstract concept, but a muscular structure that can be held and examined. The intestines are not symbols on a page, but coiled tubes of remarkable length. This direct encounter with anatomy, however constrained by the framework of ancient authority, plants seeds that will eventually flower into genuine anatomical science. Mondino writes his own anatomical manual, the Anatomia, and it becomes widely used in medical schools. But it is largely a compilation of Galenic anatomy, with only modest additions from his own observations. When what he sees contradicts the classical texts, he generally defers to the texts. The rete mirabile that exists in cattle but not in humans still appears in his descriptions because Galen described it. The authority of the written word still outweighs the evidence of the eyes. Through the 14th and 15th centuries, human dissections become more common, though still rare by modern standards. Universities obtain permission to dissect the bodies of executed criminals, usually limiting themselves to 1 or 2 cadavers per year. These dissections are public spectacles, sometimes conducted during carnival season, theatrical events that draw crowds. The human body opened and displayed becomes a memento mori, a reminder of mortality, a religious and philosophical lesson as much as a medical education. But something is shifting in European culture more broadly. The Renaissance, that complex movement of artistic, intellectual, and cultural renewal, brings new interest in the natural world, new confidence in human ability to understand and represent reality. Artists like Leonardo da Vinci begin to study anatomy with passionate intensity, not just to read about bodies but to understand them well enough to depict them accurately. Leonardo dissects corpses himself, making hundreds of detailed drawings that are more accurate than anything in the medical texts of his time. Leonardo's anatomical drawings reveal a mind unencumbered by medical training, willing to see what is actually there rather than what should be there according to ancient authority. He draws the muscles of the shoulder with precise attention to their layering and attachments. He depicts the heart with its actual structure, not Galen's theoretical version. He even attempts to understand function through form, injecting wax into organs to reveal their internal spaces, creating casts of the brain's ventricles to understand their shape. But Leonardo is an artist working in private, and his anatomical studies remain largely unknown during his lifetime. His notebooks, filled with observations that would have revolutionized anatomy, stay hidden in private collections, their insights unavailable to physicians and medical students. The revolution in anatomy will come not from the artist's studio but from the medical school, and it will require someone with the skill to observe, the knowledge to understand what he is seeing, and the courage to contradict centuries of authority. That person arrives in Padua in 1537. His name is Andreas Vesalius, and he is 23 years old, brilliant, ambitious, and utterly convinced that the only way to learn anatomy is through direct observation. Born in Brussels, educated at Paris, Vesalius has become dissatisfied with the traditional method of anatomical instruction. He has watched professors read from texts while barbers hack at bodies, has noticed the discrepancies between what is written and what is visible, and he has decided that this is not good enough. In Padua, Vesalius receives an appointment as professor of surgery and anatomy. Immediately, he does something radical. He performs his own dissections. This may not seem revolutionary, but it shatters the traditional hierarchy. A university professor, a man of learning, does not engage in manual labor. But Vesalius understands that to truly learn anatomy, one must touch the structures, trace the vessels, follow the nerves with one's own hands. Reading about the body is not enough. Watching someone else dissect is not enough. One must do it oneself. Vesalius is fortunate in his timing and location. Padua's authorities are willing to supply him with bodies of executed criminals. The judicial system provides a steady, if still limited, stream of cadavers. Vesalius dissects with intense focus, working quickly because bodies decay rapidly, especially in warm weather. He begins in winter when cold weather preserves the cadavers longer, allowing more thorough examination. As he dissects, Vesalius makes a disturbing discovery. Galen is wrong, not in small details, not in interpretation, but in fundamental descriptions of human anatomy. The liver is not five-lobed as Galen described. The rete mirabile does not exist in humans. The jaw is a single bone, not two. The sternum has 3 parts, not 7. The heart's septum is not perforated. Error after error emerges as Vesalius compares Galen's descriptions with the evidence before him. At first, Vesalius tries to reconcile these discrepancies. Perhaps human anatomy has changed since ancient times. Perhaps his specimens are abnormal. But as he dissects more bodies and finds the same deviations from Galen in every case, a radical conclusion becomes inescapable. Galen never dissected humans. The great authority, the foundation of medical education for 14 centuries, based his anatomical descriptions on animals, particularly apes, and assumed that human anatomy was identical. This realization is both liberating and terrifying. If Galen is wrong about anatomy, what else might be wrong? If the greatest authority can be mistaken, what is the foundation of medical knowledge? Vesalius faces a choice: remain silent about these discoveries, preserving the comfortable certainty of traditional medicine, or speak out, challenging the entire edifice of anatomical authority. Vesalius chooses to speak. In 1543, at age 29, he publishes De Humani Corporis Fabrica, on the fabric of the human body. It is a massive work, 7 books covering the entire human body in extraordinary detail. But more revolutionary than the text are the illustrations. Vesalius collaborates with artists, possibly from Titian's workshop, to create woodcut images of unprecedented accuracy and beauty. These are not crude diagrams but works of art that are also precise anatomical documents. The illustrations in the Fabrica show bodies in dynamic poses, muscles displayed on figures that seem alive despite being obviously dissected. Skeletons stand in contemplative poses against landscapes. The progression of images shows layer after layer of dissection, as if the reader is participating in the anatomical exploration. For the first time, a medical text treats the human body as something beautiful, worthy of artistic attention, rather than merely a degraded physical shell. But the Fabrica is not just beautiful, it is accurate in ways that no previous anatomical text has been. Vesalius corrects Galen's errors systematically, describing human anatomy as it actually is. He shows the heart structure clearly, noting that the septum is solid, not perforated. He describes the skeleton accurately, correcting the number of vertebrae, the structure of the sternum, the formation of the jaw. He traces blood vessels and nerves with precision, naming structures and explaining their relationships. The publication of the Fabrica is met with both excitement and outrage. Some physicians, particularly younger ones, recognize it as a breakthrough, a liberation from ancient errors. They begin to study anatomy directly, to perform their own dissections, to trust their eyes rather than their texts. Medical education starts to change, with anatomy based on observation rather than authority. But many established physicians react with fury. They accuse Vesalius of arrogance, of disrespecting the ancients, of making errors himself. Some argue that if Vesalius's observations differ from Galen, it must be because human anatomy has degenerated since ancient times. Others suggest that Vesalius is examining abnormal bodies. The idea that Galen could be fundamentally wrong is too threatening to accept. It undermines the entire basis of their medical knowledge, their professional identity, their life's work of mastering classical texts. Vesalius himself seems shaken by the vehemence of the response. Shortly after publishing the Fabrica, he leaves academic medicine, becoming physician to the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V. He burns many of his notes and unpublished works. Whether this is due to the controversy, personal ambition, or other factors remains debated. But the effect is that Vesalius largely withdraws from the anatomical revolution he started. Yet the revolution continues without him. The Fabrica inspires a generation of anatomists who take up the method of direct observation. In Padua, Vesalius's successors continued detailed dissection. Gabriel Falloppio discovers the tubes connecting ovaries to uterus, structures that still bear his name. Bartolomeo Eustachi describes the tube connecting the ear to the throat. These men and others make discoveries that Vesalius missed, refining and extending the new anatomy. The printing press amplifies these discoveries in ways that would have been impossible in earlier eras. The Fabrica is expensive, but it is copied, reprinted, plagiarized. Cheaper anatomical texts appear, some quite good, others less so, but all participating in the shift toward observational anatomy. Students across Europe can now access accurate illustrations of human anatomy, can compare different authors' descriptions, can develop critical judgment about anatomical questions. The supply of bodies for dissection gradually increases. As human dissection becomes more accepted, as its medical value becomes recognized, authorities are more willing to allocate the corpses of executed criminals to medical schools. Some universities develop agreements ensuring regular supply. The actual number of dissections remains limited by modern standards. A medical student might witness a dozen dissections during their training rather than one or two, but this is sufficient to ground anatomical knowledge in observation rather than texts. Artists and physicians begin to collaborate more systematically. Anatomical illustration becomes a specialized skill. Artists learn anatomy to make their illustrations accurate, while anatomists learn the principles of visual representation to make their discoveries comprehensible. The result is a flowering of anatomical art, beautiful, precise, serving both aesthetic and scientific purposes. This collaboration between art and science reflects the Renaissance ideal of the universal person, skilled in multiple domains. Anatomy is not just technical knowledge for physicians, it is part of the broader intellectual culture. Educated people study anatomy to understand the human form, to appreciate the body's complexity, to reflect on the relationship between structure and function. The body becomes a subject of legitimate inquiry, no longer solely the province of medical specialists. The Church's response to this anatomical revolution is more nuanced than often assumed. There is no blanket prohibition against dissection, no systematic persecution of anatomists. Individual clerics may object, and certain practices, like the dissection of saints or venerated persons, remain absolutely forbidden. But the institutional Church generally tolerates and sometimes supports anatomical education, recognizing its medical value. Papal physicians include skilled anatomists. Catholic universities conduct dissections with ecclesiastical approval. What the Church opposes is not dissection itself, but certain conclusions that might be drawn from it. Materialist philosophy, the idea that the body is all there is, that soul and consciousness emerge from physical structures rather than being divinely implanted. This is dangerous ground. Anatomists must be careful to present their work as revealing God's design, the divine architecture of the human form, rather than suggesting that understanding anatomy eliminates the need for spiritual explanation. This negotiation between religious authority and scientific inquiry characterizes much of Renaissance intellectual life. Knowledge advances, but carefully, with attention to theological implications. Vesalius dedicates the Fabrica to Emperor Charles V, a pious Catholic, and frames his work as revealing divine wisdom in creation. He does not challenge the existence of the soul or the resurrection of the body. He simply describes the physical structure more accurately than Galen did. As the 16th century progresses into the 17th, the accumulation of anatomical knowledge accelerates. William Harvey, studying at Padua in the early 1600s, builds on Vesalius's accurate description of the heart to understand circulation, that blood flows in a circuit, pumped by the heart, rather than being consumed in the tissues as Galen believed. This discovery, published in 1628, completes the overthrow of Galenic physiology that Vesalius began with anatomy. The bodies of criminals, once simply disposed of as waste, have become precious resources, books of knowledge written in flesh. Each cadaver, properly dissected, reveals truths that libraries of text could not convey. The condemned man, executed for his crimes, inadvertently contributes to human knowledge, his body teaching in death what his life never could. There is something troubling about this dependence on executed criminals. It means that anatomical education relies on capital punishment. That knowledge literally requires death. It also means that the bodies being studied are disproportionately those of the poor and marginalized. The wealthy can usually avoid execution, while the poor face the scaffold for relatively minor crimes. The social inequity embedded in this system will eventually prompt ethical reflection, but in the Renaissance, it is simply the practical reality of how anatomical knowledge is obtained. By 1600, the anatomical revolution Vesalius sparked is complete in its essentials. Medical education throughout Europe is based on direct observation of human anatomy. Students expect to participate in dissections, to see the structures they are learning about. Anatomical theaters are built in universities, circular spaces with rising tiers of seats surrounding the dissection table, allowing many students to observe simultaneously. These theaters become points of pride, symbols of a university's commitment to modern medicine. Textbooks multiply, each author claiming to offer improvements on predecessors, new observations, better illustrations. The quality varies enormously from careful, accurate works to derivative compilations full of errors. But the principle is established. Anatomical knowledge comes from looking at bodies, not from reading ancient authorities. Galen's shadow has not disappeared entirely. His name is still in vogue, his contributions still acknowledged, but he is no longer the final authority. His descriptions can be questioned, corrected, superseded. This shift from authority to observation represents a profound change in how knowledge is validated. For over 1,000 years, a claim was considered true if it appeared in authoritative texts, if it was consistent with Aristotle or Galen or Scripture. Now, increasingly, a claim is considered true if it matches observation, if it can be demonstrated through dissection or experiment. This epistemological revolution extends far beyond anatomy, influencing all of natural philosophy, but anatomy is where it is most visible, most concrete. The human body, opened and examined, becomes proof that nature itself, not ancient texts, is the ultimate authority. The awakening is not yet complete. Much remains unknown about how the body functions, about the microscopic structures that 17th century anatomists cannot yet see, about physiology and pathology and countless other questions. But a method has been established, a way of approaching these questions that will eventually answer them. Look, cut, observe, describe, compare, question. This simple sequence of actions performed on the silent bodies of the dead will unlock secrets that philosophy alone could never reveal. The Renaissance has awakened anatomical science from its long sleep, and it will not slumber again. The dawn light has barely touched the graveyard when the men arrive with their shovels. They work quickly, quietly, their movements practiced and efficient. The grave is fresh, buried yesterday, perhaps the day before. The earth is still loose, easy to move. Within an hour they have reached the coffin. They pry it open, remove the body, strip away the shroud which they leave behind. Stealing a body is only a misdemeanor, but taking the burial clothes is theft, a more serious crime. They bundle the corpse into a sack, refill the grave hastily, and disappear into the pre-dawn darkness. By the time the sun rises fully, they are gone, and with them goes someone's mother, someone's child, someone's beloved, destined now not for eternal rest but for the dissection table. This is body snatching, and in the 18th and early 19th centuries, it becomes a thriving, horrifying trade. The resurrection men, as they call themselves with grim humor, are responding to a simple economic reality. Medical schools need bodies, far more bodies than the law provides, and they are willing to pay. What begins as an unfortunate necessity evolves into a crisis that will shake public confidence in medicine, inspire grave, robbing countermeasures ranging from the ingenious to the bizarre, and ultimately lead to murder when entrepreneurs realize that creating fresh corpses is more profitable than stealing old ones. The roots of this crisis lie in the very success of the anatomical revolution. By 1700, medical education throughout Europe and the American colonies is based on practical anatomy. Students must observe dissections, must understand the human body through direct examination. This is proper medical training, scientifically sound, absolutely necessary for producing competent physicians. But it creates an insatiable demand for cadavers. The legal supply of bodies comes almost exclusively from executed criminals. In England, the Murder Act of 1752 specifically adds dissection to the punishments for murder, both as additional deterrent and as a way to supply anatomists. But executions, while tragically common, do not produce nearly enough bodies for the growing number of medical schools and students. London alone has multiple medical schools, each needing dozens of cadavers per year for demonstration and student practice. Edinburgh, The premier medical school in Britain has even greater needs. The mathematics are simple and damning legal supply cannot possibly meet legitimate demand. Medical schools could respond by limiting enrollment, but they are profit-making enterprises, and more students mean more revenue. They could conduct fewer dissections, but this would compromise educational quality, producing poorly trained physicians. So they take a third path. They turn a blind eye to where their cadavers come from, as long as someone delivers them to the back door and asks no awkward questions about their origin. This willful ignorance creates opportunity for the resurrection men. These are not romantic outlaws or Robin Hood figures. They are businessmen operating in a gray zone of legality and morality, providing a service for which there is genuine demand. Some are failed medical students who know the trade. Others are simply criminals who recognize a profitable enterprise. They organize themselves with remarkable efficiency, forming gangs that divide territory, negotiate with medical schools for steady contracts, and perfect the techniques of their grim profession. The actual work of body snatching requires skill and nerve. The men prefer fresh graves. Bodies recently buried are easier to extract and less decomposed, thus more valuable. They must work at night in graveyards, surrounded by superstitious fear and very real legal danger. If caught, they face imprisonment, mob violence, or both. They develop specialized tools, wooden shovels that make less noise than metal ones, hooks for dragging bodies from coffins, dark lanterns that can be shuttered quickly to hide their light. They learn which graveyards have lax security, which sextons can be bribed to look the other way, which parishes bury their dead in easily accessible locations. They read death notices in newspapers to identify fresh graves. They cultivate informants at workhouses and hospitals who can alert them when someone dies, especially someone whose body might not be closely guarded. The poor, the friendless, those who die alone. The trade becomes so organized that price lists emerge. A fresh adult corpse might bring several pounds, a substantial sum for working-class men. Children's bodies are worth less, but still valuable for teaching pediatric anatomy. Teeth can be harvested and sold separately to dentists for use in dentures. Body snatching becomes a business with its own economics, its own professional standards, its own territorial disputes. Public awareness of body snatching creates widespread horror and anxiety. Families begin taking elaborate precautions to protect their dead. The wealthy build morgues, secure buildings where bodies can be kept until decomposition makes them worthless for dissection. They construct morgue safes, iron cages placed over graves until the body decays. Patent coffins appear designed with locks, iron bars, or complex mechanisms to prevent theft. Watchtowers are built in graveyards, and families hire guards to watch fresh graves for the critical first week after burial. These measures help those who can afford them, but the poor remain vulnerable. Their graves are the ones most often violated, their bodies the ones most easily stolen. This class dimension of body snatching creates deep resentment. The wealthy whose sons study medicine and who can protect their own dead benefit from anatomical education made possible by the violation of working-class graves. The poor bear the cost, losing their dead to dissection while having no access to the medical knowledge gained thereby. The anxiety runs deeper than mere property crime. 19th century Britain holds complex beliefs about death, burial, and the body. Christianity teaches the resurrection of the body, and while sophisticated theologians understand this spiritually, many ordinary people believe in literal physical resurrection. To have one's body dissected, cut apart, scattered might interfere with this resurrection. Even for those with less literal beliefs, the body carries profound meaning. It deserves respect, dignified treatment, peaceful rest. To end up on a dissection table naked, cut open, studied by students, represents a violation beyond death, a final indignity that cannot be rectified. Riots occasionally erupt when body snatchers are caught or when dissection rooms are discovered. Mobs attack anatomy schools, destroy specimens, assault anatomists and students in New York in 1788. The doctors' riot erupts when children playing near a hospital see medical students waving body parts at them through windows. The riot spreads, medical facilities are attacked, and militia must be called to restore order. Similar incidents occur throughout the English-speaking world wherever medical schools operate. Medical professionals find themselves in an impossible position. They need bodies to train physicians competently. Without anatomical education, doctors cannot safely perform surgery, cannot understand disease, cannot practice medicine effectively. But obtaining those bodies requires either breaking the law or relying on criminals who break it on their behalf. The entire medical profession becomes complicit in a system they find distasteful, but see no alternative to. Some anatomists try to work only with legally obtained bodies, but this proves impossible if they want to run viable medical schools. Some advocate for legal reform, for laws that would provide more bodies through legitimate means, but such reforms face public opposition. Most simply participate in the system while trying not to think too carefully about where their subjects come from. Then, in Edinburgh, the system produces its inevitable horror. Two Irish immigrants, William Burke and William Hare, stumble into the body trade in 1827. They begin conventionally enough. When a tenant in Hare's lodging house dies owing rent, Burke and Hare sell the body to Dr. Robert Knox, a prominent anatomist, receiving a good price. But Burke and Hare quickly realize something. Why wait for people to die naturally when you can create fresh corpses yourself? Over the next year, Burke and Hare murder at least 16 people, probably more. Their method is efficient and leaves few marks. They suffocate their victims, a technique that will later be called burking. Their victims are marginal people, prostitutes, the elderly, the poor, the drunk, people whose disappearance prompts little investigation. Burke lures victims to Hare's lodging house with promises of shelter or drink, and then they kill them and sell the bodies to Knox, who asks no questions about this remarkably fresh supply of cadavers. The murders continue until November 1828, when neighbors discover a body hidden in Burke's lodging and alert authorities. The investigation reveals the full horror. Burke and Hare have turned murder into a business, treating human beings as raw material to be processed and sold. The public reaction is explosive, profound, and lasting. Hare turns king's evidence against Burke to save himself. Burke is tried, convicted, and sentenced to hang. In a final irony that the authorities intend as justice, Burke's body is publicly dissected at the Edinburgh Medical School. Thousands queue to view his corpse. His skeleton remains on display to this day, a grim reminder of where the desperation for anatomical knowledge led. Dr. Knox, the anatomist who bought the bodies, faces no criminal charges. He claims, probably truthfully, that he had no certain knowledge the bodies were murdered. But his reputation is destroyed. Mobs attack his home and lecture hall. Students desert his classes. He eventually leaves Edinburgh, his career ruined. Living proof that the body trade has corrupted more than just the resurrection men. The Burke and Hare case crystallizes public horror at the anatomy system. It proves what people feared, that the demand for bodies creates incentives for murder, that the resurrection trade can evolve into something unspeakably evil. Parliamentary inquiries follow. Newspapers demand reform. The medical profession itself recognizes that the current system is unsustainable. Public trust has been too badly damaged. The result is the Anatomy Act of 1832, a piece of legislation that attempts to resolve the crisis by dramatically expanding the legal supply of bodies. The act allows medical schools to claim the bodies of paupers who die in workhouses, hospitals, or prisons if no one claims them for burial within a certain period. It also permits people to donate their own bodies for dissection, creating a legal pathway for voluntary contribution to medical education. The Anatomy Act succeeds in its immediate goal. It provides enough bodies to supply medical schools legitimately, effectively ending the resurrection trade. Body snatching becomes unnecessary and largely ceases. medical education can continue without depending on criminals and violated graves. From this perspective, the act is a triumph, a rational solution to a pressing social problem, but the act carries troubling implications that become clear only gradually. In solving the body supply crisis, it effectively shifts the burden of dissection from criminals to the poor. Under the old system, executed murderers were dissected, people who had committed serious crimes and forfeited their lives. Under the new system, paupers are dissected, people whose only crime is poverty, dying alone and friendless. This creates a new class dimension to dissection. The wealthy can still ensure their bodies are buried intact by providing for their own funerals or by donating to anatomy voluntarily if they choose. But the poor, if they die in workhouses or hospitals without family to claim them, go to the dissection table automatically. The threat of dissection becomes part of the stigma of poverty. Another way the destitute are treated differently from their fellow citizens. This is particularly bitter because dissection still carries profound cultural meaning. Despite the act's attempt to normalize it, ending up on an anatomy table remains something most people desperately want to avoid. It represents failure to provide for one's own burial, failure to have family or friends who care enough to claim your body, failure to matter enough that anyone will protect you even in death. The poor, already marginalized in life, face this final indignity in death. The Victorian poor understand this clearly. The fear of being dissected, of ending up on the anatomy table unclaimed and unmourned, drives people to spend money they can barely afford on burial insurance. Burial societies and friendly societies proliferate, offering working class people a way to ensure they will have proper funerals. People scrimp and save to avoid the pauper's grave that leads to the dissection room. From a utilitarian perspective, the Anatomy Act makes perfect sense. Dead bodies have no interests, feel no pain, suffer no indignity. Using unclaimed bodies for medical education harms no one while benefiting society enormously through better, trained physicians. The dead cannot object, and the living who might object, the deceased's family and friends, are by definition absent in the cases covered by the Act. But this utilitarian logic misses something important about human dignity and social equality. How we treat the dead reflects how we value people in life. A society that dissects the poor while protecting the wealthy broadcasts a clear message about whose bodies matter, whose dignity deserves protection. The Anatomy Act, for all its practical success, embeds this inequality into law and medical education. Medical students studying anatomy in the decades after 1832 work on bodies that are overwhelmingly those of paupers. These students, largely from middle and upper classes, learn their profession by dissecting people from a different social world. Some develop empathy, recognizing their common humanity with the body before them. Others become hardened, seeing the cadaver not as a person but as a specimen, an educational resource. The dissection room becomes a space where class differences are literally inscribed on the body, where the poor serve the education of the wealthy even in death. There is also the question of consent or its absence. The Anatomy Act allows bodies to be claimed if family or friends do not collect them, but this is hardly meaningful consent. The deceased did not choose dissection, they simply had no one with resources to prevent it. Some people do donate their bodies voluntarily under the Act's provisions, but they remain a small minority. Most bodies come from those who had no choice, whose poverty and isolation made them vulnerable to this final appropriation. Yet, despite these troubling implications, the Anatomy Act represents genuine progress in some respects. It ends the resurrection trade, that nightmare of violated graves and murdered victims. It provides legal certainty, allowing medical schools to operate openly rather than in shameful complicity with criminals. It makes anatomical education more systematic and thorough, contributing to genuine improvements in medical practice. The physicians trained through this system, learning anatomy from paupers' bodies, go on to make remarkable advances. They develop safer surgical techniques, better understand disease processes, improve diagnostic methods. The knowledge gained from dissection saves countless lives. The ethical compromise that enabled this knowledge, the use of bodies obtained through social inequality rather than genuine consent, is rarely acknowledged, but it is real. By the mid-19th century, the crisis has passed. Body snatching fades into memory, becoming a gothic tale, a horror story from the bad old days. Medical schools receive steady supplies of cadavers through legal channels. Students can train properly without anyone having to rob graves or murder strangers. The system works in its way, even if it works by making the poor bear costs that the wealthy avoid. The resurrection men themselves disappear from history, their names mostly forgotten, their profession obsolete. Some die in poverty, some emigrate, some fade into other criminal enterprises or legitimate work. They are remembered, when remembered at all, as ghouls, villains, body snatchers. The role they played in advancing medical knowledge goes unacknowledged, because acknowledging it requires admitting how desperate the medical profession became for bodies, how far it was willing to go, how much it was willing to compromise. Burke's skeleton, still displayed in Edinburgh, stands as memorial to the darkest moment of this dark trade, when the demand for bodies created incentive for murder, when human beings became commodities, when the pursuit of knowledge led not just to moral compromise but to evil. Yet in the same building, students still study anatomy, still learn from the dead, still pursue the knowledge that saves lives. The shadow of the resurrection men lingers over this work, a reminder that medical knowledge, like all knowledge, has costs, and those costs are not always distributed fairly or borne by those who benefit most from what is learned. The body lies on the cold table, pale and still, its secrets locked within. But this is not a medical school, and the anatomist who approaches with scalpel and notebook is not seeking to understand the general architecture of human flesh. This examiner has a different question, more specific and infinitely more consequential. How did this person die? And if foul play is suspected, the even more pressing question, can the body itself testify against the murderer? In the 19th century, as forensic pathology emerges from the broader practice of anatomy, the autopsy room becomes a place where the dead speak, where silent flesh becomes eloquent witness, where justice itself depends on reading the book written in wounds and organs, in blood and bone. The transformation of autopsy from purely medical investigation to criminal investigation happens gradually, born from the intersection of advancing anatomical knowledge and the needs of legal systems struggling to determine cause of death in suspicious cases. Physicians have long been called upon to examine bodies in cases of suspected murder, but their conclusions are often vague, based on external examination and general principles rather than systematic internal investigation. The corpse might show obvious trauma, a crushed skull, a knife wound, but what of subtler deaths? What of poisoning, suffocation, deaths that leave no clear external marks? The emerging science of pathology begins to provide answers. As physicians become better at understanding normal anatomy, they also become better at recognizing abnormal conditions. Diseases leave characteristic traces in organs. Violence produces specific patterns of injury. The careful autopsy, performed with attention to detail and grounded in anatomical knowledge, can reveal things that external examination never could. The question becomes, can this medical knowledge serve justice? In Paris, a physician named Mathieu Orfila begins asking exactly this question. Born in 1787, Orfila becomes fascinated by poisons, their effects on the body, their detection, their use in crime. Poisoning is a persistent problem in 19th century criminal justice. It is the perfect crime, silent, often undetectable, easily disguised as natural death. A wife who wishes to rid herself of an unwanted husband, an heir impatient for inheritance, a lover removing an obstacle. Poison offers a method that leaves little obvious evidence. Traditional methods of poison detection are crude and unreliable. Perhaps the victim vomited. Perhaps there was unusual discoloration, perhaps someone noticed a suspicious taste in the food. But these signs are ambiguous, easily attributable to natural illness. Orfila realizes that the answer lies not in external signs but in the body's tissues themselves. Poisons leave traces, chemical signatures that can be detected if one knows where to look and how to test. Orfila begins systematic experiments, administering various poisons to animals and then examining their organs, looking for characteristic changes. He develops chemical tests that can detect arsenic, mercury, and other common poisons in tissues even after death. His work culminates in a massive treatise on toxicology published in 1814. That becomes the foundation of forensic poison detection. For the first time, prosecutors have a scientific method for proving poisoning beyond the ambiguity of symptoms. The implications are immediate and dramatic. In 1840, Orfila testifies in the trial of Marie Lafarge, a young French woman accused of poisoning her husband with arsenic. The case becomes a sensation. Marie is educated, articulate, and maintains her innocence with compelling emotion. But Orfila examines the husband's exhumed body and detects arsenic in the organs. His testimony, delivered with scientific authority, proves decisive. Marie is convicted, and the trial establishes the principle that chemical analysis of tissues can constitute legal proof of poisoning. This principle transforms criminal justice. Poisoners can no longer rely on the undetectability of their method. The body itself becomes evidence, its tissues testifying to the presence of toxic substances. This forces poisoners to become more sophisticated, using poisons that mimic natural diseases, varying doses to avoid obvious patterns, but it also makes them more vulnerable to detection by equally sophisticated medical examiners. While Orfila revolutionizes toxicology, other physicians begin developing systematic approaches to autopsy in criminal cases. They recognize that different types of death leave different patterns of evidence. Drowning produces specific findings in the lungs. Strangulation leaves marks on the throat and broken blood vessels in the eyes. Blunt force trauma creates characteristic patterns of bleeding and tissue damage. The skilled pathologist learns to read these signs, to distinguish accident from murder, suicide from homicide. The challenge is that this knowledge must be communicated to judges and juries who lack medical training. The pathologist must become translator, explaining complex anatomical findings in language that laypeople can understand, making the body's testimony comprehensible to those who judge guilt or innocence. This requires not just medical knowledge but also communication skills, the ability to convey certainty about some conclusions while acknowledging uncertainty about others. In Edinburgh, where the memory of Burke and Hare still lingers, forensic medicine develops with particular rigor. The city's medical school begins offering specialized instruction in medical jurisprudence, the application of medical knowledge to legal questions. Students learn not just to perform autopsies but to document findings, to distinguish relevant from irrelevant observations, to present conclusions clearly and defensively. One Edinburgh-trained physician, Henry Littlejohn, becomes particularly influential. Appointed as Edinburgh's first medical officer of health, and also serving as police surgeon, Littlejohn combines public health work with forensic investigation. He performs hundreds of autopsies in suspicious deaths, testifying in numerous trials. His careful documentation and clear testimony establish standards for forensic practice. He demonstrates that the medical witness can be credible, objective, resistant to pressure from either prosecution or defense. Littlejohn's work highlights a crucial aspect of forensic pathology. The pathologist must serve truth, not advocacy. Unlike other expert witnesses who may be hired by one side, the forensic pathologist ideally serves the court itself, providing objective findings regardless of whom they favor. This ideal is not always achieved. Pathologists can be biased, can make errors, can be swayed by preconceptions, but it establishes a standard against which forensic testimony can be judged. In London, the position of coroner gains new medical sophistication. Coroners, traditionally legal rather than medical officials, begin working more closely with physicians in investigating unexpected deaths. The coroner's inquest, a public hearing to determine cause of death, becomes a venue where medical evidence is presented and evaluated. Pathologists testify about their findings, juries hear the body's evidence, and determinations are made about whether death resulted from natural causes, accident, suicide, or homicide. Some cases become famous, not just for their criminal significance but for what they reveal about forensic methods. In 1910, Dr. Hawley Crippen murders his wife in London, dismembers her body, and buries the remains in the basement while claiming she has left him and moved to America. He then moves his mistress into his home, and the couple lives openly together. When suspicion finally falls on Crippen, he flees to Canada by ship with his mistress disguised as a boy. The forensic investigation that follows demonstrates the power of the new medical detective work. Dr. Bernard Spilsbury, a young pathologist, examines the buried remains. The body is so decomposed and dismembered that identification seems impossible, but Spilsbury finds a piece of skin with a surgical scar. Medical records show Mrs. Crippen had surgery in that exact location. This single piece of tissue becomes damning evidence. Meanwhile, the ship's captain recognizes Crippen from newspaper descriptions and uses the newly invented wireless telegraph to alert authorities. Crippen is arrested upon landing, tried and convicted largely on Spilsbury's forensic evidence. Bernard Spilsbury becomes the most famous forensic pathologist in Britain, testifying in dozens of high-profile murder trials. His authority becomes almost unassailable. Juries trust his conclusions implicitly. Judges defer to his expertise. This demonstrates both the power and the danger of forensic pathology. Spilsbury is skilled and generally accurate, but his certainty sometimes outpaces the evidence. He testifies with absolute confidence even in cases where the findings are ambiguous. His reputation means his testimony is rarely challenged effectively, potentially leading to wrongful convictions in cases where he might be mistaken. The Spilsbury phenomenon reveals a persistent problem in forensic pathology, the tension between scientific uncertainty and legal demands for clear answers. Science often deals in probabilities, in findings that are consistent with certain conclusions but do not prove them absolutely. But courts want definitive answers. Did this person die of poisoning or natural causes? Was death instantaneous or delayed? Could the wounds have been self-inflicted? The pathologist faces pressure to provide certainty, even when honest science would require qualification and acknowledgement of ambiguity. Meanwhile, in continental Europe, different approaches to forensic medicine develop. In France and Germany, institutes of legal medicine are established at universities, combining research, teaching, and practical casework. These institutes develop standardized protocols for autopsy in criminal cases, systematic methods for documenting findings, rigorous training programs for forensic pathologists. The approach is more systematically scientific than the British model, less dependent on individual expert witnesses, more focused on reproducible methods and peer review. Toxicology continues to advance throughout the 19th century. New analytical methods allow detection of ever smaller quantities of poison. The Marsh test for arsenic, developed in 1836, can detect amounts far too small to be found by earlier methods. Spectroscopy allows identification of substances based on the light they emit when heated. Microscopy reveals cellular changes caused by various toxins. The poisoner's arsenal of undetectable substances shrinks steadily as analytical chemistry advances, yet poisoning remains a threat precisely because toxicology is so demanding. Unlike determining that someone died from a gunshot wound, obvious to any competent pathologist, identifying subtle poisoning requires specialized knowledge, expensive equipment, and time-consuming analysis. Many deaths that might involve poison are never investigated thoroughly simply because local authorities lack the resources or expertise. The sophisticated toxicology practiced in major cities remains unavailable in rural areas or smaller jurisdictions. The late 19th century also sees growing understanding of how injuries reveal the manner of their infliction. Alexandria in France makes detailed studies of gunshot wounds, showing how the pattern of powder burns, the trajectory of bullets, and the characteristics of entrance and exit wounds can reveal the distance and angle of shooting. This allows pathologists to determine whether a gunshot was fired at close range or from a distance, whether it could have been self-inflicted, whether the body was moved after death. Similarly, pathologists learn to read the patterns of blood distribution in cases of beating or stabbing. Blood spatters in characteristic ways depending on the force and direction of blows. The distribution of bruises reveals whether injuries occurred before or after death. Living tissue responds to trauma differently than dead tissue. These observations transform the autopsy from simple description of injuries to reconstruction of the events that caused them. The autopsy room becomes a place where stories are extracted from silent witnesses. The pathologist, working alone with the body, traces the narrative of death. This wound was inflicted first, when the victim was standing. These defensive wounds on the hands show the victim tried to ward off attack. This pattern of lividity indicates the body was moved several hours after death. Piece by piece, the evidence accumulates, and a story emerges, not always complete, not always certain, but often sufficient to support or refute claims about what happened. This storytelling aspect of forensic pathology creates both power and responsibility. The pathologist's narrative often goes unchallenged because the primary witness, the deceased, cannot contradict it. Defense attorneys may question interpretations, may bring their own experts to offer alternative explanations, but the physical findings are what they are. The pathologist's reading of those findings carries enormous weight in criminal proceedings. Some pathologists abuse this power. Errors occur not just from incompetence but from bias, from too close relationships with police or prosecutors, from conclusions reached before the autopsy is complete, and then forcing the evidence to fit. The history of forensic pathology includes wrongful convictions based on flawed medical evidence, on pathologists who testified with certainty about things they could not actually know, on findings that were later disproven when techniques improved or additional evidence emerged. The most tragic cases involve death of children. Infant mortality is common in the 19th century, but distinguishing natural death from infanticide requires careful pathological investigation. Did the baby die of disease, or was it smothered? Was this a stillbirth, or was the child born alive and then killed? These questions have life or death consequences for accused mothers, and pathologists' answers are not always correct. The history includes women executed for infanticide based on flawed forensic evidence, on misunderstandings of how infant bodies respond to various conditions. As the 19th century progresses into the 20th, forensic pathology becomes increasingly specialized and professionalized. Medical schools add forensic medicine to their curricula. Professional organizations form, setting standards for practice and creating forums for sharing knowledge. Journals publish case studies and new techniques. What was once an occasional sideline for physicians becomes a distinct specialty with its own body of knowledge and practitioners. The autopsy room itself changes. Early forensic autopsies were performed in whatever space was available: mortuaries, hospital basements, even in people's homes where bodies had been discovered. But specialized facilities begin to appear, designed for the specific needs of forensic investigation. Good lighting, proper ventilation, photographic equipment, laboratory space for chemical analysis. The modern morgue emerges, purpose-built for the work of reading death. Photography becomes particularly important. The pathologist can now document findings visually, creating permanent records that can be reviewed by others, presented in court, preserved for future reference. The photographs are often disturbing, bodies opened and displayed, injuries documented in stark detail, but they provide evidence that words alone cannot convey. A photograph of a wound pattern, of the position of organs, of tissue changes can communicate more clearly than lengthy written description. By the early 20th century, the principle is firmly established: the body is evidence, and the skilled pathologist can make it speak. Criminal justice relies on this testimony in thousands of cases. Murderers are convicted based on forensic findings. Innocent people are exonerated when autopsy reveals that death was natural or accidental rather than criminal. Insurance disputes are resolved by determining cause of death. The autopsy room has become an essential institution in modern society, a place where science serves justice, yet this service is imperfect, limited by the pathologist's skill, the available technology, and the inherent ambiguities of interpreting biological evidence. The body tells its story, but that story must be read, interpreted, translated into language and testimony. Different readers may reach different conclusions. The same evidence may support multiple narratives. The certainty that courts demand often exceeds what the science can honestly provide. The legacy of 19th century forensic pathology is thus mixed. It represents genuine progress, the development of scientific methods for investigating death, the accumulation of knowledge about how different causes of death manifest in the body, the creation of toxicological techniques that can detect poisoning. These advances serve justice by making murder more detectable, by providing objective evidence in addition to witness testimony, by allowing the dead themselves to testify about their fate. But this progress comes with costs. The authority granted to forensic pathologists creates potential for error and abuse. The demand for certainty encourages overconfidence. The specialization of knowledge means that pathologists' conclusions are difficult for laypeople to evaluate or challenge. The field attracts some individuals who are more interested in the prestige of being expert witnesses than in the careful, humble pursuit of truth. As the 20th century dawns, forensic pathology stands as an established discipline, with standards, training programs, professional organizations, and a crucial role in criminal justice. The autopsy room has proven itself as a place where scientific investigation can serve the cause of justice, where the silent testimony of the dead can speak truth to power, where careful observation and analysis can penetrate mysteries that witnesses and circumstantial evidence cannot solve. The body, that text written in flesh, has found its readers, and they have transformed how society understands death, investigates crime, and pursues justice. The 20th century dawns with a confidence bordering on hubris. Medicine has never been more powerful, more scientifically grounded, more capable of understanding the human body. X-rays discovered in 1895 allow physicians to see inside living patients. Laboratory tests reveal diseases at the microscopic level. Surgical techniques improve dramatically, saving lives that would have been lost just decades earlier. And autopsy, the practice of examining the dead to understand how and why they died, stands at the pinnacle of medical investigation, standardized, systematic, and seemingly indispensable to both clinical practice and medical progress. In the early decades of the century, autopsy rates in major hospitals approached 90%. Nearly every patient who dies undergoes post-mortem examination. This is not merely for legal purposes or in cases of suspected foul play, but as standard medical practice. Physicians want to know, was the diagnosis correct? Did the treatment work as expected? What actually killed this patient? The autopsy room is where clinical medicine confronts its successes and failures, where hypotheses are confirmed or refuted, where the truth written in organs supersedes the theories constructed in the ward. This systematic approach to autopsy produces remarkable standardization. Professional organizations develop detailed protocols for how autopsies should be performed. The procedure becomes ritualized, almost choreographed. The external examination comes first, measuring, weighing, photographing, noting any marks or abnormalities. Then the internal examination follows a predictable sequence. The body is opened with a Y-shaped incision from shoulders to sternum to pubis. The chest plate is removed, exposing heart and lungs. Organs are examined in situ, their positions and relationships noted, then removed, weighed, sectioned, and described in meticulous detail. Each organ follows its own protocol. The heart is examined for size, wall thickness, valve function, coronary artery disease. The lungs are assessed for consolidation, edema, tumors, emphysema. The liver is weighed, its surface examined, sections cut to reveal internal architecture. The kidneys, spleen, pancreas, intestines, each receive systematic attention. The brain, accessed through a separate incision across the back of the scalp, is particularly carefully examined, sliced into sections that reveal strokes, tumors, hemorrhages, degenerative changes. The pathologist dictates findings into a recording device or to a secretary, creating a detailed narrative of the body's landscape. This report becomes part of the medical record, a permanent document describing what was found. Tissue samples are preserved in formalin, later embedded in paraffin, sectioned impossibly thin, stained with dyes, and examined under microscopes. These microscopic examinations often reveal things invisible to the naked eye: cellular changes, inflammatory processes, early cancers, infections. This systematic approach transforms autopsy into a powerful quality control mechanism for clinical medicine. When diagnosis and autopsy findings align, physicians gain confidence in their clinical skills. But when discrepancies appear, when autopsy reveals a misdiagnosis, an unsuspected disease, an unexpected complication, medicine learns. These discrepancies, carefully studied and catalogued, reveal the limitations of clinical diagnosis, the diseases that mimic others, the rare presentations of common conditions, the common presentations of rare ones. Studies from this era consistently show significant discrepancies between clinical diagnosis and autopsy findings. In 15 to 25% of cases, autopsy reveals major diagnoses that were completely unsuspected during life. These are not trivial findings but conditions that, had they been recognized, might have changed treatment and outcome. A patient thought to die of heart failure actually had a massive pulmonary embolism. Someone diagnosed with pneumonia had lung cancer. A stroke attributed to atherosclerosis was actually caused by a ruptured aneurysm. These discoveries are not failures of individual physicians but reflections of medicine's inherent limitations. The human body is complex. Diseases interact in unpredictable ways. Symptoms can be ambiguous, and even the best clinician, lacking definitive tests, must sometimes make educated guesses. The autopsy reveals these uncertainties, providing feedback that improves medical practice, generally even when it cannot help the individual patient. Beyond quality control, systematic autopsy produces genuine scientific discoveries. New diseases are first recognized at autopsy. In the early 20th century, pathologists identify and characterize conditions that were previously unknown or poorly understood. Alzheimer's disease, first described in 1906, was discovered through autopsy examination of a woman with progressive dementia, revealing the characteristic plaques and tangles in her brain tissue. Legionnaire's disease, emerging in 1976, was identified when autopsy of outbreak victims revealed a previously unknown bacterium in lung tissues. The relationship between smoking and lung cancer becomes clear through autopsy studies. As cigarette consumption increases through the early and mid-20th century, pathologists begin seeing more lung cancer. Systematic autopsy studies comparing the lungs of smokers and non-smokers reveal the dramatic differences in cancer rates and the dose-dependent relationship between smoking duration and cancer risk. This autopsy-based evidence becomes crucial in establishing smoking as a public health crisis. Similarly, autopsy studies illuminate the pathology of atherosclerosis and heart disease. By examining the coronary arteries of thousands of people who died from various causes, pathologists map the progression of atherosclerosis from early fatty streaks in teenagers to severe blockages in older adults. These studies reveal that heart disease begins decades before symptoms appear, that risk factors like cholesterol and blood pressure correlate with arterial damage, that heart attacks result from specific patterns of vessel blockage. This knowledge transforms cardiology, enabling preventive approaches and targeted treatments. Infectious diseases yield their secrets to autopsy examination. The influenza pandemic of 1918-1919 kills tens of millions worldwide, and autopsy studies reveal the lung damage caused by this particularly virulent strain. During the polio epidemics of the mid-century, autopsies of children who die from the disease show the virus's predilection for motor neurons in the spinal cord, explaining the paralysis that characterizes the illness. These findings guide vaccine development and treatment approaches. Yet even as autopsy proves its value, seeds of its decline are being planted. The very success of modern medicine begins to reduce autopsy rates. As diagnostic technologies improve, physicians gain more confidence in their clinical diagnosis. Why perform an autopsy when the diagnosis seems clear from clinical findings, laboratory tests, and imaging studies? The question seems reasonable, but it rests on an assumption that clinical diagnosis, even with modern tools, is sufficiently accurate that autopsy adds little value. This assumption proves wrong, but it takes time for this to become apparent. Through the mid-20th century, autopsy rates remain high in academic medical centers, though they begin declining in community hospitals. Teaching hospitals continue to value autopsy as an educational tool, allowing physicians in training to see the diseases they read about in textbooks. But outside these academic centers, autopsy becomes increasingly seen as optional, an unnecessary expense, something to be done only in legally required cases or when families specifically request it. The cost of autopsy becomes a factor. Someone must pay for the procedure, the pathologist's time, the laboratory work, the detailed report. In the early 20th century, this was considered part of standard hospital operations, an essential cost of providing good medical care. But as healthcare costs rise and hospitals face financial pressures, autopsy becomes a budget item to question. It generates no revenue, the patient is already dead, and third-party payers generally don't reimburse for it. The economic logic pushes toward fewer autopsies. Cultural factors also play a role. In the early 20th century, death is more familiar, more accepted as a natural part of life. Bodies are often prepared at home. Funerals are family affairs, and there is less squeamishness about the physical reality of death. But as the century progresses, death becomes medicalized, professionalized, removed from everyday experience. Bodies go directly from hospital to funeral home. Families view the deceased only after embalming and cosmetic preparation, and the physical facts of death become hidden behind professional services. In this context, autopsy begins to seem more invasive, more disturbing. Families, when asked for permission to perform autopsy, often refuse. The idea of cutting open a loved one, examining their organs, taking tissue samples, it feels like violation, like preventing the body from resting in peace. Religious concerns resurface. Some faiths that had accommodated autopsy in the era when it seemed medically essential become less comfortable with it when it seems optional. The legal framework shifts as well. In earlier eras, hospitals often performed autopsies without explicit family consent, operating under the assumption that advancing medical knowledge justified the procedure. But patients' rights movements of the 1960s and 1970s changed this dynamic. Consent becomes paramount. Except in cases where law requires autopsy, suspicious deaths, deaths in custody, certain public health scenarios, autopsy can only be performed with family permission. This gives families veto power, and many exercise it. Physicians themselves become less insistent about autopsy. The older generation of doctors, trained when autopsy was standard, gradually retires. Younger physicians, trained in an era of CT scanners and MRIs, of laboratory tests that can diagnose conditions with remarkable precision, see less value in post-mortem examination. They have confidence in their clinical diagnosis, reinforced by sophisticated technology. The idea that autopsy might reveal something important seems less compelling when so much can be learned from the living patient. By the 1980s and 1990s, Autopsy rates in most hospitals have fallen below 20%. In many community hospitals, they approach zero. Autopsies are performed only when legally mandated, almost never for clinical purposes. This decline continues despite persistent evidence that autopsy still reveals significant discrepancies between clinical diagnosis and actual findings. Studies from the late 20th century show that major misdiagnoses remain common, occurring in 10 to 15% of cases even with modern diagnostic technology. These misdiagnoses cluster in predictable patterns. Pulmonary embolism remains frequently unsuspected. Blood clots in the lungs can produce vague symptoms that mimic other conditions. Infections, particularly in elderly or immunocompromised patients, often present atypically and are misdiagnosed. Cancers can hide, particularly in organs not easily imaged, or in patients with multiple medical problems, where symptoms are attributed to known conditions. Adverse drug reactions and complications of medical procedures sometimes go unrecognized. The decline in autopsy rates means these discrepancies increasingly go undiscovered. When patients die with uncertain diagnoses and no autopsy is performed, the questions remain unanswered. Medicine loses the feedback that autopsy provides. Physicians don't learn about their misdiagnosis, so they don't adjust their diagnostic approaches. Rare presentations of diseases go undocumented. Unexpected drug reactions remain unknown. The accumulation of clinical experience that autopsy enables, learning from every death, diminishes. This loss becomes particularly apparent in medical education. In earlier eras, physicians in training attended numerous autopsies, seeing the diseases they had read about, understanding the gross and microscopic pathology, connecting clinical presentations with anatomical changes. By the late 20th century, many medical students and residents complete training having attended few or no autopsies. They learn pathology from textbooks and slides, but miss the three-dimensional understanding, the sense of how organs relate to each other, the visceral impact of seeing what disease does to the human body. Some pathologists fight against this decline, arguing eloquently for autopsy's continuing value. They point to the persistent discrepancy rates, to the discoveries still made, to the educational importance. They argue that imaging, however sophisticated, cannot replace direct examination, that CT scans and MRIs show structure but not always function, that microscopic changes crucial for diagnosis often aren't visible on imaging, that unexpected findings still occur regularly at autopsy. These arguments are correct but increasingly ignored. The momentum toward fewer autopsies seems unstoppable, driven by economic pressures, cultural shifts, technological confidence, and simple inertia. Each generation of physicians, having less experience with autopsy than the previous one, values it less, requests it less often, and trains the next generation to value it even less. Yet autopsy continues to reveal important truths. When performed, it still discovers unsuspected diseases, identifies causes of death that clinical evaluation missed, provides closure for families seeking answers, catches medical errors before they can be repeated. The HIV/AIDS epidemic of the 1980s and 1990s produces many autopsies, as physicians seek to understand this new disease's protein manifestations. These autopsies reveal the opportunistic infections that plague AIDS patients, the unusual cancers, the direct effects of HIV on various organs. This knowledge gained from systematic autopsy examination shapes treatment approaches and helps physicians recognize AIDS-related complications. In the 21st century, autopsy faces an uncertain future. Rates continue to decline in most institutions, approaching single digits in many hospitals. Yet certain niches remain where autopsy is valued. Forensic autopsy continues for legal purposes. Perinatal autopsy, examining stillbirths and infants who die shortly after birth, remains important for counseling parents about future pregnancies. Academic medical centers maintain autopsy programs, recognizing their educational value even if clinical demand has diminished. New technologies modify autopsy practice. Virtual autopsy, using CT or MRI to examine bodies without cutting them open, emerges as a possibility. This approach appeals to families who object to traditional autopsies' invasiveness and to cultures or religions that prohibit body violation. Virtual autopsy can reveal structural abnormalities, fractures, some tumors, and patterns of injury. But it misses much that traditional autopsy finds: microscopic changes, certain infections, subtle organ abnormalities, toxicological evidence. Virtual autopsy is a compromise, better than no examination but inferior to traditional methods. Molecular pathology adds new dimensions to autopsy. Tissue samples can now be analyzed genetically, revealing inherited conditions, identifying specific cancer mutations, detecting organisms that cannot be cultured by traditional microbiology. Autopsy in the genomic age becomes more powerful, capable of answering questions that were previously inaccessible. Yet this enhanced capability requires expertise and resources that many institutions lack. The fundamental question remains: what do we lose when autopsy declines? We lose quality control over clinical diagnosis. We lose the discovery of unexpected findings that advance medical knowledge. We lose educational opportunities for physicians in training. We lose specific information about individual cases. Families who want to know exactly what killed their loved one. Physicians who want to know if treatment decisions were appropriate. Researchers studying disease patterns. But we also lose something more subtle: the humility that autopsy imposes on medicine. The autopsy room is where medical certainty confronts biological reality, where confident diagnoses are sometimes revealed as wrong, where the complexity of disease exceeds our understanding. This confrontation with uncertainty, with the limits of knowledge and technology, serves as a valuable corrective to medical hubris. When autopsy rates are high, every physician knows that their diagnostic accuracy will eventually be checked against objective evidence. This promotes careful thinking, diagnostic humility, and acknowledgement of uncertainty. As autopsy declines, this feedback loop weakens. Physicians can maintain confidence in diagnoses that might be wrong, can attribute unexplained deaths to presumed causes without verification, can miss patterns that would be apparent if more autopsies were performed. The quality of medical care may suffer in ways that are difficult to measure but nonetheless real. The modern autopsy, when performed, remains a profound encounter with human mortality and medical truth. The pathologist, working in the quiet morgue, away from the urgency of clinical care, reads the body's final testament with care and attention. The organs weighed and examined tell their stories of life and death, of diseases endured, of treatments received, of the moments when systems failed and life ended. This knowledge, gained from the generous dead who teach in silence, represents one of medicine's most valuable resources, one that we are, tragically and perhaps unwittingly, allowing to slip away. In a quiet office at a medical school, a woman in her 70s signs a document that will not take effect until after her death. She is healthy or healthy enough, with no immediate plans to die. But she has made a decision that stretches beyond her own lifetime, a decision rooted in gratitude and hope. Decades ago, her daughter's life was saved by surgery that would have been impossible without the anatomical knowledge gained from dissection. Now, she wishes to give back, to become herself a teacher, to allow her body, when she no longer needs it, to educate the next generation of physicians. She signs the body donation form, receives a card to carry in her wallet, and leaves with a sense of peace. She has made a covenant with the future, a silent promise that her death will serve life. This scene repeats itself thousands of times each year across the world. People of all ages, though mostly elderly, arrange to donate their bodies to medical schools. Their motivations vary. Some are motivated by gratitude for medical care received, others by a desire to contribute to science, still others by simple practicality, seeing body donation as a useful alternative to expensive funerals. But whatever brings them to this decision, they share a common generosity, a willingness to become, in death, what they could never be in life: a medical textbook in flesh, a three-dimensional anatomy lesson, a silent teacher. The process of body donation has changed dramatically from the grim days of the Resurrection Men and the troubling implications of the Anatomy Act. Modern body donation is entirely voluntary, based on informed consent given by the donor during life. No one's body is taken without their explicit permission. No families are left wondering what happened to their loved ones. The covenant is explicit, transparent, and honored with a respect that would have been unimaginable in earlier centuries. When a person who has arranged body donation dies, the medical school is notified. The body is transported with dignity, received with gratitude, and treated with profound respect throughout its use in medical education. Students who work with donated bodies are taught that they are encountering their first patients, people who are teaching them even in death, whose gift makes their medical education possible. Many medical schools hold memorial services for body donors, inviting families, honoring the deceased by name, acknowledging the extraordinary contribution they have made. The practice of dissection itself has evolved. Modern anatomy education often uses prosection, bodies dissected in advance by instructors, rather than having every student perform complete dissection. This maximizes the educational value of each donated body while maintaining the hands-on learning that remains essential. Students still touch the tissues, trace the nerves and vessels, feel the textures that no photograph can convey, but the process is more guided, more respectful, more efficient than in earlier eras. Some programs have developed remarkable ways to honor donors while using their bodies for education. Plastination, a technique developed by Gunther von Hagens, preserves bodies in polymer, creating specimens that can be used indefinitely, that don't decay or require toxic preservatives, that can be posed to demonstrate specific anatomical relationships. These plastinated bodies serve education for decades, multiplying the teaching impact of each donation. Controversial exhibitions of plastinated bodies have toured worldwide, bringing anatomical education to millions who would never set foot in a medical school dissection lab. The ethics of these public exhibitions remain debated. Von Hagens claims all bodies were donated with informed consent, but questions persist, particularly about specimens that apparently came from China where consent practices may not meet Western standards. The commercialization of anatomy, charging admission to view plastinated bodies, troubles many who feel that donated bodies should serve education, not entertainment or profit. The boundary between legitimate anatomical education and voyeuristic spectacle proves difficult to maintain. These ethical complexities reflect ongoing tension about how society should relate to the dead body. Even with full consent, even with the highest respect, there is something unsettling about displaying dissected humans publicly, about making anatomical knowledge accessible to those who have no medical purpose for it, about transforming the human body into a museum exhibit. Yet advocates argue that demystifying anatomy, making it accessible, helps people understand their own bodies and appreciate the gift that medical knowledge represents. Meanwhile, in hospitals and morgues, autopsy continues its quieter work. Though autopsy rates have declined dramatically from their mid-century peak, certain cases still demand this ultimate investigation. When a young person dies unexpectedly, when death occurs during or shortly after medical procedure, when new diseases emerge, when families desperately need answers, autopsy remains the gold standard for determining what happened. These modern autopsies still make discoveries that clinical evaluation missed. A study published in 2019 found that major diagnostic errors persisted in approximately 8% of autopsies, despite all advances in imaging and laboratory testing. These errors were not trivial. They involved conditions that, had they been recognized, might have changed treatment and outcome. Pulmonary embolism, bacterial endocarditis, ruptured aneurysms, unsuspected cancers. The same conditions that eluded diagnosis in earlier eras continue to hide from even our most sophisticated technologies. The autopsy room remains a place where medical mysteries find resolution. When a patient dies unexpectedly during surgery, Autopsy can reveal whether the death resulted from unavoidable complication, surgical error, anesthesia reaction, or underlying disease. This knowledge matters profoundly for the family seeking to understand what happened, for the medical team evaluating their practices, for the hospital assessing whether procedures need to change, for future patients who might face similar circumstances. Some autopsies solve mysteries that extend far beyond individual cases. When a new infectious disease emerges, autopsy of early victims reveals the pathology, guides diagnosis in subsequent cases, and suggests treatment approaches. During the COVID-19 pandemic beginning in 2020, autopsies of patients who died from the disease revealed unexpected findings, not just the lung damage that was anticipated, but blood clots throughout the body, damage to kidneys and heart, inflammatory processes that were not apparent from clinical evaluation. These autopsy findings led to changes in treatment protocols, recognition of thrombosis as a major feature of severe COVID, and use of anticoagulants that saved lives. The COVID pandemic also revealed how much autopsy knowledge had been lost as rates declined over previous decades. Many hospitals had closed their autopsy facilities or reduced staff. Pathologists skilled in performing thorough autopsies had retired without training successors. When the pandemic created urgent need for autopsy data, the infrastructure to provide it had atrophied. Some institutions scrambled to revive dormant programs, to recruit pathologists willing to perform autopsies on highly infectious bodies, to re-establish protocols that had been abandoned. This scramble demonstrated what advocates had been arguing for years: autopsy retains unique value that cannot be replaced by imaging or other technologies. A CT scan shows lungs filled with fluid, but autopsy reveals the cellular architecture of damage, identifies specific inflammatory patterns, detects secondary infections, and provides tissue for research. An MRI shows brain swelling, but autopsy allows measurement of exact pressures, identification of specific vascular changes, detection of subtle abnormalities that imaging cannot resolve. Virtual autopsy, sometimes called virtopsy, has emerged as a partial solution to declining traditional autopsy rates. Using high-resolution CT and MRI imaging, radiologists can examine bodies non-invasively, creating detailed three-dimensional models of internal anatomy. This approach appeals to families who object to traditional autopsy's invasiveness and to cultures where body integrity after death carries religious or cultural significance. Virtual autopsy excels at certain tasks. It clearly shows fractures, making it valuable in trauma cases. It reveals bullet trajectories, fluid accumulations, major vascular abnormalities, and many tumors. It can be performed quickly, doesn't require specialized autopsy facilities, and preserves the body intact for burial or cremation. In some Scandinavian countries, virtual autopsy has largely replaced traditional autopsy for forensic cases. But virtual autopsy has significant limitations. It cannot detect microscopic changes, the cellular architecture that reveals infection, inflammation, early cancer, degenerative disease. It misses toxicological evidence that requires tissue sampling. It cannot assess organ texture, color, consistency, qualities that experienced pathologists use to detect abnormalities. It provides images to interpret rather than organs to examine, introducing a layer of mediation between the investigator and the body. The future likely involves hybrid approaches: virtual autopsy for initial evaluation, followed by targeted traditional autopsy if specific questions arise. This maximizes efficiency while preserving access to the full power of autopsy when needed. But it requires pathologists skilled in both imaging interpretation and traditional autopsy techniques, and such expertise is increasingly rare as autopsy practice declines. Molecular pathology adds new dimensions to what can be learned from the dead. Tissue preserved from autopsy can now be analyzed genetically, revealing inherited conditions that explain unexplained deaths, identifying cancer mutations that suggest why certain treatments failed, detecting organisms that evade traditional microbiological culture. The autopsy room. Equipped with modern molecular tools, can answer questions that would have been unanswerable just decades ago. Postmortem genetic testing reveals inherited cardiac conditions that cause sudden death in young people, long QT syndrome, hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, Brugada syndrome. Identifying these conditions through autopsy allows screening of family members who may carry the same mutations, potentially preventing future sudden deaths. A single autopsy that identifies an inherited condition might save multiple lives in the affected family. Similarly, autopsy tissue can be used for research that benefits not the individual deceased, but future patients with similar conditions. Brain tissue from people who died with Alzheimer's disease advances understanding of neurodegeneration. Hearts from cardiac patients illuminate mechanisms of heart failure. Lungs from chronic disease victims reveal pathways of lung damage. These research uses of autopsy tissue, conducted with appropriate consent and ethical oversight, extend the gift of body donation far beyond immediate educational purposes. The ethical framework governing use of the dead has become increasingly sophisticated. Medical schools and hospitals have ethics committees that review autopsy and body donation programs. Consent processes ensure that donors understand how their bodies will be used. Families have rights to be informed about findings, to receive tissue for burial if desired, to know that their loved one was treated with respect. Yet ethical challenges persist. What happens to tissue retained from autopsy or dissection? Historically, collections of organs, slides, and tissue blocks accumulated in pathology departments, sometimes for decades, without clear consent for long-term retention. Modern regulations require that retention be explained and consented to, but vast collections remain from earlier eras when such consent was not obtained. Some of these historical collections have immense scientific value: slides of rare diseases, specimens documenting conditions before modern treatments, tissued from epidemics that no longer occur. Destroying them would eliminate irreplaceable resources, but retaining them raises questions about consent, ownership, and respect for the dead. Various jurisdictions have reached different conclusions, balancing preservation of scientific resources against respect for autonomy and dignity. The question of who owns a dead body, who has authority over it, remains surprisingly unsettled in law and ethics. The deceased left a body but is no longer present to have interests in it. Family members may have emotional attachments and cultural or religious views about proper treatment, but they did not create the body and may not know what the deceased would have wanted. Society has interests in medical education, disease investigation, and criminal justice. Balancing these competing claims requires careful ethical reflection and clear legal frameworks. Cultural differences complicate these questions. Some cultures see the body as sacred, requiring specific burial or cremation practices, making autopsy deeply problematic. Others view the body more instrumentally, as a vessel that can be reused for beneficial purposes once the person has departed. What seems respectful in one cultural context may seem disrespectful in another. Medical institutions in multicultural societies must navigate these differences sensitively. Religious traditions vary widely in their approach to autopsy and body donation. Judaism traditionally opposes autopsy except when required by law or necessary to save lives, based on principles of respecting the dead and prompt burial. Some Islamic scholars take similar positions, though others accept autopsy when there is medical or legal necessity. Christianity generally permits autopsy and body donation, seeing them as gifts that serve others. Buddhism often embraces body donation as a final act of compassion. These are generalizations within each tradition. Different schools of thought exist, and individual believers make personal decisions. The medical community owes profound gratitude to those who donate their bodies, who consent to autopsy, who allow their remains to serve education and discovery. This gratitude must be more than rhetorical. It must manifest in respectful treatment, in careful use of the gift given, in honoring the memory of those who teach in silence. Many medical schools have developed beautiful traditions around this gratitude. Some hold annual services where students read poems or reflections about their experiences in anatomy lab, acknowledging the profound gift they have received. Some create memorials listing donors' names, ensuring they are remembered. Some invite donor families to meet students, creating connections between the gift and those who benefit from it. These practices recognize that body donation is not a commercial transaction but a human relationship, asymmetric, certainly since one party is dead, but nonetheless real and meaningful. The student who spends months dissecting a cadaver develops a relationship with that person, learning their anatomy in intimate detail, discovering surgical scars that tell stories of lives lived, noticing arthritic changes or healed fractures or other traces of individual history. Some students find this relationship difficult, troubling, overwhelming. They are learning medicine by cutting apart someone who once lived, loved, laughed, suffered. The emotional complexity of this experience, gratitude mixed with sorrow, intellectual fascination alongside visceral discomfort, is part of medical education's hidden curriculum, teaching empathy and humility alongside anatomy. Looking forward, the future of learning from the dead will likely involve multiple modalities working together. Traditional dissection will continue, serving educational purposes that cannot be met otherwise. Virtual autopsy will expand, offering less invasive investigation where full autopsy is not necessary. Molecular pathology will advance, extracting ever more information from ever smaller tissue samples. Digital anatomy atlases, created from scans of thousands of bodies, will provide reference standards while acknowledging normal variation. 3-dimensional printing may allow creation of anatomical models from individual patients, letting surgeons practice complex procedures on replicas before operating on living people. Virtual reality might enable students to perform dissections digitally, learning anatomy without requiring cadavers, though whether such virtual experience provides the same deep understanding remains uncertain. But whatever technological advances emerge, they will supplement rather than replace the fundamental practice of learning from actual human bodies. There is something irreplaceable about touching real tissue, seeing actual variation, confronting the three-dimensional complexity that no image fully captures. The covenant between the living and the dead, between those who donate their bodies and those who learn from them, will endure as long as medicine seeks to understand human biology. This covenant is fundamentally asymmetric. The dead give, the living receive, and there can be no direct reciprocation. But the gift generates obligations nonetheless. Those who learn from the dead must use that knowledge well, must become skilled physicians worthy of the sacrifice made on their behalf, must extend to their own patients the care and respect they learn to show to their silent teachers. In the quiet of the dissection lab, in the solemnity of the autopsy room, a profound transaction occurs. The dead, who can no longer speak, teach those who still can. Bodies that have lost life serve to sustain it, to improve it, to understand it. The human form, that mystery that has fascinated and perplexed humanity throughout history, reveals its secrets gradually, generation after generation, through the generosity of those who allow their mortal remains to become instruments of discovery. We owe them remembrance. We owe them respect. We owe them the commitment to use what they teach us in service of healing, in pursuit of knowledge, in honoring the profound gift they have given. The silent covenant between medicine and those who teach in death is one of humanity's most extraordinary relationships, a bond that transcends mortality itself, ensuring that even in death we continue to serve life, to illuminate darkness, to transform mystery into understanding. This covenant, maintained across centuries and into whatever future awaits, stands as testimony to both the generosity of the human spirit and the unending human quest to understand ourselves, written in the language of flesh and bone, taught by those who speak only through their silence.